Welcome back to another one of Nathan Bell's Centurion videos. This is video number 85 or 6, I think.
Something like that.
So today, Nate wanted to talk to you, after you've liked and subscribed, of course, Nate wanted to talk to you about how he draws inspiration for his novels and his work.
Yeah, well, I was going to talk specifically about when I wrote Kings of the New Age, The Quest of the Balancing Stones. There's a number of influences that poured into Kings of the New Age, The Quest of the Balancing Stones. I watched up to season 4 of Game of Thrones, and I just thought everything about... I haven't read the books, because I haven't read any fiction in about 10 years. I've been reading entirely... factual information for the last 10 years, so I haven't been doing any fiction, but I watched up to season 4 of Game of Thrones, and I just thought everything was fantastic. So George R.R. Martin must be just a brilliant writer, and one day I will sit down and read the books. But what I observed about Game of Thrones was how engaging it was from a political perspective, seeing the fictitious the ruling class of the kingdom, of the Seven Kingdoms, and the fictitious factions vying for power between each other. And so when I wrote Kings of the New Age, that was definitely something I wanted to achieve. I wanted to create a scenario where there were these believable ruling elite class of the city, and that's who the Kingsgang are under General Bruce. They're the ruling class who've taken over the city. So I wanted to create an interesting and exciting dynamic where there were different factions battling for power. And in Kings of the New Age, you've got General Bruce and his gang, and then you've got the Union members, then you've got the socialist groups. So you've got all these, and then you've got the mafia. So you've got all these different factions, and they come together and they overthrow General Bruce as the factions battle with each other. So I thought all the faction warfare in Game of Thrones was just fantastic. It was so engaging and so in-depth and elaborate, with the conniving and the scheming that the characters would do, the stabbing in the back, and the drama that took place in the Game of Thrones series, as much of it as I watched up to season 4. So when I wrote Kings of the New Age, I was definitely trying to emulate that and create not a similar dynamic, but a dynamic of the same quality. My dynamic is very different to Game of Thrones, but I wanted to create a dynamic to the same standard that obviously George R.R. Martin had created in his novels, and that the producers had created in the television series. And I'm also with the book was also heavily influenced by author Chuck Palahniuk, again, whose book I haven't read, but I've seen Fight Club, because what I took from Fight Club, I thought, this movie, and it's the same with Game of Thrones. It's this extreme content presented in a way that it's not unbearable. There's some brutal murders in Game of Thrones, and there's also some hot sex scenes, and there's some rape and incest and all this controversial stuff in Game of Thrones. And in Fight Club, there's all this controversial dark content as well, these hot sex scenes and this violence and this extreme graphic content, but done in a way that it's not too confronting that you can't watch it. I took that from watching Fight Club, that Chuck Palahniuk must be a very controversial thinker and a very extreme thinker, because Fight Club's a very extremely violent movie, and I understand him to be a shock author. So when I wrote Kings of the New Age, my mentality was, I'm going to be like Chuck Palahniuk. I'm going to write a shocking book, which is super violent, super sexual, super controversial, but done in a tasteful way. And my book's also very powerful and has some very strong messages in it. It's not just about senseless, brutal violence. So I took from Chuck Palahniuk how to be an extreme writer and to shock people a bit. And I like to shock people a bit because it gets them on edge, it gets them thinking, stimulate people, get them talking. I like to try and, with everything I do, I try to stimulate people in a way that puts them a bit out of their comfort zone, but not too far out of their comfort zone that they want to attack me or something. But I try to get people out of their comfort zone with a bit of shock content and get them talking about the real issues. And for me, the real issues, as you know, are like war and conflict and death and violence and all the suffering and tragedy in the world. So I took from Chuck Palahniuk how to be a shock writer, And also a very intelligent shock writer Chuck Palahniuk is, because if you understand Fight Club, it's all about a cult group, and it's a fascinating view. It's a fascinating story about the formation of a cult group. So it's a very intelligent book, dealing with controversial content. So I decided I wanted to be like Chuck Palahniuk when I wrote Kings of the New Age, and write a book that was extreme, but in a tasteful way. And if you read Kings of the New Age, The Quest of the Balancing Stones, there's like 6 or 7 sex scenes in the book. There's rape scenes, there's scenes of torture and brutality, there's a man who gets crucified and stoned to death. It's just a brutal book. And there's so much brutal violence and brutality, and so many of the characters die in the book. It's just all throughout the book. Of course, it's got this underlying message of the people have to fight for their own freedom, and that's the truth of what's happening in the book. So it's not just this senseless gore content. There's a powerful message underlying it. And I took the same thing from George R.R. Martin through watching Game of Thrones, because as I said, the series Game of Thrones was very graphic, with some very brutal murders in it, and a lot of sex as well. So I figured that must be how George R.R. Martin writes, so I'm going to write like that. So that's why the book's so graphic and obscene in some parts, and so extreme, and I did that on purpose. But there's other influences to Kings of the New Age as well, like it's modelled off the hero's journey. I think the best hero's journey is The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, the best hero's journeys ever written. If you know what the hero's journey is, it's a formula for writing fantasy stories. It's like Hercules' classic adventure, whatever particular adventure you want to refer to of Hercules and the Greek heroes who went on adventures. It's the hero's journey. So I use the hero's journey in Kings of the New Age. The adventurers get given a holy divine quest, and then they must embark on a quest, and then they go through all these trials and tribulations, and people die, and there's suffering, and they have to make decisions, and at the end they return home victorious, having saved the world. And it's sort of a little bit like Lord of the Rings as well, because the adventure they go on, and at the end of the adventure they have to go down into a cave and throw stones down a hole which leads to the centre of the earth. And in the Lord of the Rings they have to throw a ring into a volcano, and that's how they save the world. So it's kind of similar but different. So it's that quest model. So the hero's journey and the quest model is definitely in the book. And I've read other quest adventure books like Dragonlance and different fantasy books where they have to go on an epic adventure. So those books inspired that as well. And I also want to credit one of my favourite writers. What's his name? I haven't read his books in about 12 years, but he was inspirational as well, because he's got this whole mythical, magical, modern thing going on, which is similar to my book. What was his name? I can't remember his name now, but he wrote The Word and the Void, and that was one of the best books I ever read. Thoroughly enjoyed it. So he's an inspiration. The guy who wrote The Word and the Void and Armageddon's Children is an inspiration for my books as well. So those are some of the influences that went into the book, and some of the authors I've tried to model myself off. And I definitely intentionally went for that shock angle, and that's why I say to people, don't give Kings of the New Age, The Quest of the Balancing Stones, to children under 15. It's not suitable. It's got too much adult content, and people should know the book is not for small children. It's an adult fiction. So I decided specifically that I was going to write a sex-heavy, violence-heavy and drug-heavy adult fiction for young adults. And that's partly because I kind of wanted to push censorship limitations as well. I thought, I'm going to be a bit pushy with the world here. I'm going to push censorship limitations. I agree with censorship in many respects, and you can watch my video on censorship, so I won't labour on censorship, but I wanted to push censorship limits a bit and write something that was a bit extreme but in a tactful way. So definitely I modelled myself off those writers who do that in a tasteful way that's effective. So there's some of the influences for Kings of the New Age, The Quest of the Balancing Stones. Drop a comment in the comment section and tell me what you think and what your influences are if you're a writer.